Okay, continuing on the vein of examining a study or two that has some interesting implications and questioning sometimes how it's done, this is actually one that came across my radar through Nature Climate Change because it was mentioned there in Nature, a Nature journal, though not actually published there. This is published in International Organization: The Effects of Naming and Shaming on Public Support for Compliance with International Agreements and Experimental Analysis of the Paris Agreement. So, let's have some fun with this. So this is also, again, behind a paywall, this particular article. So I will, for my Locals members, I will put a PDF copy, because I have a PDF copy of it, into Locals for you. And we can get into, you can get into reading it if you would like. Because, yeah, like right here, it's behind a paywall. So if you're not, not at a university, it may be very difficult to get a hold of it. But I do recommend looking at it. And if I have problems with microphones, I'm sorry. All I want for Christmas is a microphone that does stop buzzing in my ear, and then I have to jiggle the thing so it stops, and then I lose volume. I apologize. I have no control over that right now. It doesn't seem to be cooperating with me. But let us get on into the actual article itself. The effects of naming and shaming on public support for compliance with international agreements and experimental analysis of the Paris Agreement. So I have some things highlighted here that we're going to look into just to try and keep this moving along, again, because this might be a long video as I'm walking through an article. Climate change is one of the most significant challenges facing the planet. Given the worldwide reliance on fossil fuels, addressing the problem will require international cooperation. The 2015 Paris Agreement represents the most recent attempt to promote international cooperation on climate change. Each country that joined the agreement publicly declared how it would contribute to the collective goal of mitigating climate change. The agreement did not stipulate legal or economic sanctions for members that failed to meet their promises, however, leading many scholars and policymakers to decry the lack of formal enforcement as the agreement's Achilles heel. Yes, this is a very true statement. When the Paris Agreement came up, there was actually no enforcement mechanism. There was no way to do sanctions if somebody didn't comply with their pledge to reduce carbon emissions by X by a certain time. And so it was effectively very toothless. It had no enforcement mechanism. Now, it's my understanding that COP26, the recent one in Scotland, one of the things it was meant to do was to actually address some of that and come up with a rule book to play by for the Paris Agreement. Doesn't seem like it was quite so successful in doing that. But that's a whole other question. That's a whole other thing. Some have expressed the hope that naming and shaming could sustain international cooperation. Naming and shaming occurs when some actors publicly denounce others for doing something wrong. Jacquet and Jameson characterized the potential to shame laggards as the soft but significant power of the Paris Agreement, and Faulkner regarded shaming as the main tools countries could use to exhort laggards to raise their game. In other words, step it up. Exhort laggards. Step it up, yeah. We investigate how shaming by foreign countries might affect domestic political support for honoring the Paris Agreement. We know of no direct studies on this question, but research about the effect of shaming on respect for human rights suggests several possibilities. On the one hand, shaming could increase public support for compliance by convincing citizens that their nation's policies are shameful and need to change. On the other hand, shaming could backfire by provoking a defiant reaction in which citizens rally behind their own leaders and denounce foreign shamers. Finally, shaming could prove inconsequential if domestic audiences are insensitive to foreign opinion or believe the costs of quelling foreign criticism outweigh the benefits. Which of these three reactions we observe seems likely to depend on the behavior and the identities of the shamers and targets. To shed light on these possibilities, we use experiments to study whether and under what conditions shaming might increase U.S. public support for compliance with the Paris Agreement. Our experiments focus on three key questions. First, could shaming shift domestic opinion in favor of compliance? Second, would the effects of shaming depend on the target's behavior, including the level of compliance, and use counter-rhetoric? Finally, how might the identity of the shamers and targets moderate responses to shaming? So this is, I can already tell, because they actually have some kind of an experimental structure, that this study is better than the one I read last week for locals, which was all about counter narrative and was activism masquerading. That said, this could very well be asking the question of whether or not this could work is one thing. The other question to ask, which doesn't get asked here, but would get asked in terms of, your own moral compass or what have you, whether or not you should engage in that kind of shaming. That is a completely different question. Some would argue because this thing shows that it would be successful, and because climate change is such a problem, we need to do this in order to save the world. That could be the argument. That could very easily be an argument that happens with this. And so there is that. But others would argue that that's not appropriate to do. All I want for Christmas is a microphone that works. Let's see. So the thing about this that I did notice is that while they're talking about countries in general, they focused on the U.S. for their analysis. And they also here focused on the U.S. for a number of reasons when they're talking about a lot of other countries. So that's a caveat immediately straight away, is that the U.S. population is not like the population in other countries, whether it be other democracies or communist regimes such as the Communist Party of China. First, the U.S. is an established democracy in which opinion matters for environmental policy, so this is reasons why. Second, the U.S. is of paramount importance in the global campaign against climate change. The U.S. emits more carbon than any other democracy, and the U.S. carbon consumption per capita is among the highest in the world. So I'm going to flag this as being a little misleading, and the reason I'm going to flag it as a little bit misleading is whom is emitting more carbon per capita. Whomever is emitting more carbon depends a little bit on how you look at those emissions numbers. If you are talking about it per capita, that is a correct statement that the U.S. emits more carbon per capita than any other democracy. It's also focusing on democracy. You notice it's not talking about China here, because if you were to talk about China and the total amount of carbon emitted, that's actually China that's the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, if you're talking about the total, not the per capita. So this is just depending upon which statistic you think is more appropriate. I'm not commenting on which one I think is appropriate. I'm just pointing out there's a distinction there that people need to keep an eye on, that you might be talking about the total amount of carbon versus the per capita amount of carbon, depending when it comes to a statement like that. Our experiments yielded 3 sets of findings. First, shaming by foreign countries shifted U.S. public opinion in favor of compliance, increasing the political incentive to honor the Paris Agreement. We're going to get to that in a minute. I'm not entirely sure I agree. Second, the effects of shaming depend on the target's behavior, specifically the level of compliance and the use of rhetoric. Shaming had little impact on the U.S. government when the U.S. government... There's going to be one other thing you're going to notice. Pay attention. Pay attention to these kinds of things. You'll notice in a second what assumption they are making. In our experiments, shaming had little impact when the U.S. government made no attempt to comply or met its obligations in full. Shaming was, however, effective when the government took partial steps toward compliance but fell short of its Paris commitments. Our third set of findings concerns the role of identity. We did not observe this pattern for climate change, suggesting that the distinction between allies and non-allies may be more relevant on some issues than others. In the U.S., Democrats and Republicans differ in their beliefs about climate change and support for emissions controls. We therefore estimated reactions to shaming not only among the general public, but also for each partisan cluster that future administrations might want to court. Democrats and independents were more receptive to shaming than Republicans, a finding with important political implications. Yes, and there's a reason why the shaming thing doesn't work so well with Republicans, and it has also not much to do whether or not the belief aspect comes in. We'll get to that in a minute. This is something that I think the authors ignored, is they're ignoring the philosophical differences between Democrats and Republicans. At the same time, the study advances our understanding of the most important environmental issue on the planet. You're not actually doing anything physically with the understanding of the physics of climate change or the impacts of climate change to anything. So, no, that's a false statement. Sorry. The current approach to climate cooperation embodied in the Paris Agreement relies upon shaming again. Yeah, the Paris Agreement is itself toothless. It doesn't actually have any enforcement mechanisms in it. Agreement without formal enforcement may attract wider membership and prove more sustainable than agreements with harsh penalties. Whether the Paris Agreement succeeds will, therefore, depend on non-traditional enforcement strategies such as shaming. Shaming could target governments at 2 levels. You notice something? You notice it yet? We'll get there in a second. First, shaming could create international pressure to comply by imposing material and social costs. Research has shown that governments value not only their material welfare, but also their status in the international community. I take issue with that statement because governments, you're making the generalization that all governments value their status in the international community. I would surmise that there's a bunch of governments that don't give a damn what they look like in the international community. North Korea being one, Iran being one, China being one. I don't think they really give a damn. So that's one hell of a generalization that I take umbrage with in this case. Shaming could increase the domestic pressure to comply. It is well known that compliance with international agreements depends not only on international calculations about welfare and prestige, but also about the opinions of domestic audiences such as voters, interest groups, and elites. I don't know why, but I highlighted that because it actually bugs me that those 3 are separated. Because in theory, with a democracy, or in the United States, the case of the United States, which is not a democracy, it is a constitutional representative republic, thank you very much, those people are all supposed to be equal. You know? So why are you separating them as to be unequals, necessarily? I would have just ended that at domestic audiences, or of the domestic audience. But anyway. A lively debate exists about whether foreign shaming increases, decreases, or has no effect on domestic demands for human rights. We review this literature and adapt it to develop expectations about why foreign shaming might succeed, backfire, or have no effect on adherence to climate commitments. Shaming could inform domestic audiences, helping audiences recognize the misconduct of their own government, possible. Shaming could persuade domestic audiences that the perceived misconduct of foreign nations of the domestic nation is wrong. Foreign shaming could sensitize domestic audience to the international cost of bad behavior, including the material costs of being labeled as unreliable and the social costs of being castigated as a pariah. Foreign shaming can backfire, provoking defiance instead of compliance. Domestic audience often perceive foreign condemnation as a threat to their status. And I would surmise also that this is connected to how that foreign condemnation is portrayed in the media, because I take a wager that countries like China, who tightly control their media very well, the Communist Party of China, Chinese Communist Party, tightly controls the media. So I very strongly suspect that this wouldn't make a damn difference. This kind of reaction would be more likely from them. Thus, shaming could backfire by pushing citizens to rally behind their government instead of clamoring for reform. And also, clamoring for reform. That presumes that reform is a particularly good thing here, that a reform being pushed by an international body is a good thing for that country, which is not necessarily true. That is a presumption. A final group of scholars, argues that foreign shaming might not be consequential. Domestic audience might question the credibility and motives of foreign critics, counteract shaming by mounting a rebuttal, or conclude that the costs of foreign shaming seem minor compared to the economic or cultural costs of reform. Again, assuming reform that they put in here from global people coming in to say that they have to reform or being part of agreements that they have to reform is actually good for that country, and that's quasi-acknowledging it there. Given the ongoing debates about the effects of shaming in human rights, one should not take for granted that shaming would work in other realms of international relations. Yes and no, and here's the reason why. One of the things they didn't account for with this particular study was how high the issue of climate change itself rates with respect to other things going on in that country. If there's shaming going on with respect to an issue that, like in the United States, climate change is not the most important thing, particularly right now with the inflation and supply chain issues that we have. Climate change is not the most important thing. It is way down there on that list from my understanding of what polling data I've seen so far. So I would suspect that shaming may or may not work depending upon how the denizens of that country feel about the issue itself. Just a thought. Shaming may be more effective in some situations than in others. Full compliance occurs when, compliance is a moderator. Full compliance occurs when a country does exactly what it pledged. Partial compliance involves taking progress but ultimately falling short. And non-compliance is making no progress. We believe that shaming stands the best chance of success against partial compliers. Prima facie, partial compliance is neither laudable nor shameful. On the one hand, citizens may credit a partially complying government with making progress and keeping some of its promises. On the other hand, citizens may question whether a partially complying government has done enough to solve the problem and meet its commitments. A large literature in international relations shows that citizens disapprove of non-compliance even in the absence of shaming. I question that because of the very vast differences between countries and, again, the internal issues of the country and how domestic populace views that particular issue compared to others. So I question whether or not that is the case. Let's see. As Adler-Neeson points out, states do not just accept being stigmatized, they develop a variety of ways to cope with their sullied identity. We consider one approach to stigma management, using counter-rhetoric to minimize or even reverse the effect of shaming. Accused countries, like accused criminals, can employ a variety of rhetorical strategies ranging from contrition to defiance. Scholars have begun to study contrition, expressed through apologies, in world affairs. We now have a good understanding of how apologies affect foreign countries and interstate relations, but we know less about how apologies affect domestic audiences. At the opposite end of the rhetorical spectrum, a government could fight shaming with defiance, denying that it had done anything wrong, arguing that outsiders have no right to meddle in a country's internal affairs, and characterizing foreign shaming as an attack. And they go on here to mention China, but I don't want to dwell on that too much here, because China has done that many times where they just say fuck off to the rest of the world when when there's things going on here, particularly with human rights issues as far as the Uyghur Muslims go. Free the Uyghurs, by the way. Free the Uyghurs and free Hong Kong. Too bad, China. I don't care if you don't like me for saying it. Let's see. But there is those kinds of things. So when you're accused of something, it's natural that you're going to mount a defense, and it's expected, particularly with the different countries. So you might mount the defense of saying, I'm sorry, you're right, I'll do better. Or you might mount the defense of F off. Or what they're ignoring in this study is you might have something somewhere in the middle going on, which is actually far more realistic than being on one extreme or the other. But we will actually find out. At least it would be my assessment that it would be far more realistic to be somewhere in the middle than one extreme or the other. Expect counter-rhetoric to attenuate the effects of foreign shaming, but the degree of attenuation is an open question. Social psychologists have found, this is identities as moderators. So we talked about the counter-rhetoric as a moderator, compliance as a moderator. This is identity here. Social psychologists have found, for example, that people are more receptive to shaming by members of their in-group than members of an out-group. One might expect shaming by allies to be more effective than shaming by non-allies with respect to the Paris Agreement. Belief in anthropogenic climate change. Consider party affiliation the most important political identity in the U.S. Belief in anthropogenic climate change, support for emissions control policies, and support for the Paris Agreement tend to be stronger among Democrats than Republicans. Okay, full stop. One thing here. I study climate change. It is not a religious belief system. Would you please stop doing that? Would you please stop referring to my field as a religious belief system for Crichton? You always make it a lot harder a lot harder for me to do the work that I do at times when you do this kind of nonsense. Please stop. It's very annoying. Sorry, momentarily aggravated. Let's see. First, experiments provide a credible way. So this is the experimental approach. And then they're talking in here about why they set this up as an experiment rather than observation in the real world. And, I can understand why, because sometimes when you're dealing with the real world stuff, particularly with social science experiments like this, it's really, really, really difficult to actually narrow it down and get the experimental setup and get from the observational data what you're looking at and the answers you're trying to get that isn't confounded by some odd thing that you couldn't possibly have thought about when you were looking at your particular question. So eventually when you take things to the real world, that's where sometimes generalizations from studies don't work, because there's things in the real world that we didn't account for in the study. Experiments provide a credible way to isolate the causal effect of shaming. If shaming is in international relations occurred randomly, one could confidently use historical data to estimate the effect of shaming on domestic audiences. In reality, though, shaming is a selective and political decision. Yes, governments will act on that in their own interest if it suits them. We overcame this inferential challenge by experimentally manipulating whether foreign countries shamed or not. And so they're going to go into the experimental setup, but experiments provide a way to isolate the effects of moderator variables. So that's what they're talking about, is they're trying to make sure that they can look at the things that they're interested in and not be confounded by other weird stuff that's going on. But this is a point that I want to make. Experiments help address the unfortunate paucity of historical data. The Paris Agreement is a new development and the first global stocktake designed to assess progress and inform new pledges will not take place until 2023. Without experiments, researchers would need to wait for years for information to emerge about compliance, shaming, counter-rhetoric, and the reactions of domestic audiences. Our experiments offer a glimpse into the future, a way to anticipate events that have not taken place. So, here's the thing. The unfortunate thing about this is they have no way to validate this analysis. I don't think they have a way to actually validate it. If you don't have historical data where you're measuring this and how people feel, you have no real way to validate this for what you're saying. And that's the unfortunate kind of admission here. Yes, you can do it in an experimental state and a model state kind of thing, but you can't validate that your model of things is necessarily right. Which is the interesting part here that I have to point out. That's not necessarily something that you can validate in the real world, and partly because of all the confounders. So it's a legit thing to point out the confounders and say, we're doing this in an experimental state because of that. I'm not saying that. But the trick is applying these then in the real world. Sometimes you have to question whether or not those confounders come back in, or whether or not this is going to work in the real world, given other factors that they don't have in here that could very much influence what actually happens. The actual effects of shaming are likely to vary from case to case, which thankfully they acknowledge it, depending on public awareness of foreign commentary. 4 experiments, which we embedded in public opinion surveys of U.S. adults, and the first 3 were fielded in September and October 2018, the 4th in early January 2021. Okay, there's one thing I want to point out with this because it really matters, and unfortunately, it's not entirely their choice, but it is unfortunately a problem with this particular study, I think. This was, of course, right in the second year of the Trump administration. Here, of course, he had already responded. President Trump had already withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. And this is in early January 2021. And I believe they say later, if I remember correctly, that it was specifically done before President Biden took office. And so the thing about this is, unfortunately, I do think there's something that's not quite right in their study. And they didn't necessarily, I got to check, but I don't think they actually checked in this themselves when they did this. Unless you were living under a rock, you knew that you probably knew. Anyway, I'm not going to say you didn't, you knew for sure, but you probably knew that one of President Biden's things that he said he would do on day one was to get back into the Paris Agreement. So that was in the news during the election season of 2020. That was the wild and crazy thing that it was. So that's where I wonder with this particular 4th one, and it's going to matter in a minute, whether or not that actually whether that might have had an influence on some of their results. So weighted the sample to match the party affiliation in the U.S. around the time of our study. In all experiments, respondents considered a hypothetical future in which the U.S. had joined the Paris Agreement and pledged to reduce emissions. Now, just as a reminder, when they did the work for this study, the U.S. had not rejoined the Paris Agreement under President Biden. So that's the context background that you kind of need as you go into the experiment. Experiment 1 is to estimate the effects of shaming and assess the importance of 2 moderators, target levels compliance and the partisan identity of the domestic audiences. So this is where we're getting into compliance level, amount of shaming that was done, or whether or not shaming was done really, and partisan identity issues. So I am not going to read this entire thing, but what they're showing here, and I'm really glad that they did that, because I'm really glad that they did this whole section. I will give props to the authors of this study that they put all of this in here so that you can repeat it if you want to with others. reproducibility is supposed to be a thing we're supposed to be doing in science. So if you got to put enough in there so that I know so that I could go and reproduce this somewhere else with another group of people. The first experiment with 2,884 people. Level of compliance the U.S. achieved after joining the Paris Agreement, and whether foreign countries shamed the U.S. Or, statements of shame or denunciations or anything like that. What they have in here in this section is what the participants read before answering the questions that were asked of them in the survey here. And so this is not abnormal to see in social science kind of things. Paris Agreements and international, every country that joins promises to contribute to the worldwide goal of fighting climate change by developing and carrying out a plan to reduce its emissions of carbon dioxide as quickly as possible. The problem with, one thing I want to point out here is that this is 2,884. I don't know, and they did not say, and that's one thing I would have asked in a survey, to try and get participants for this, is how many of you have heard of X agreement? Do people even know what that agreement is before you're coming in? Because depending upon the source of news and things like that, they may have very different opinions on what the Paris Agreement is. So this is about setting the stage, and you may be contradicting a preformed opinion that somebody has about what the Paris Agreement is there. So in the future, the U.S. government must decide whether to join the Paris Agreement. Okay. All participants then considered a scenario in which the future U.S. administration joined the Paris Agreement, which did happen under the Biden administration. The Biden administration rejoined the Paris Agreement. Having established this context, we randomized what steps, if any, the U.S. government took to comply. As a member of the Paris Agreement, we pledged to reduce U.S. emissions of carbon dioxide by 25%. Some participants read that the U.S. did not pass any new laws to reduce carbon emissions. Others read that the U.S. passed laws to reduce carbon emissions by 5% or 25%. Randomized the costs, in square brackets, of these emissions control policies, but because costs were not our focus here, we averaged over costs when analyzing the data. Oh, okay. Interesting. I would have loved to see the disapproval with respect to the cost of doing something, but you ignored that. I missed that before when I first read this paper. You ignored that. No action. Over the next few years, the government did not pass any new laws to reduce carbon dioxide emissions because it did not pass any new laws. The government did not affect U.S. energy prices or U.S. carbon emissions. Do you notice what they're using here as the no action scenario? And also as the different action scenario? It's all about what the government does. It's all about what the government does. They don't take into account that, at least in democratic institutions, the people have the right to control what they do themselves, and that the free market may dictate, hey, we want more folks who reduce emissions and things like that. They don't take that into account here. It's all about what the government does. That's a flaw with this study, because it's not necessarily just the government's job, and you're making it just to be the government's job to say these different things. And yeah, I mean, there's a certain thing that some people are not going to do it without a little bit of pushing here and there. But to make it be all entirely about what the government says and what the government says you have to do, or what laws the government does to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, it's very narrow, because a lot of communities, a lot of people, a lot of different companies may very well be doing it on their own without the government's help. So can you meet the Paris Agreement without the government influence? And yet you're asking about government shaming and government compliance with international things. It's a whole different thing here, and that's what they're ignoring in this. One of the big things that I think they're ignoring in this is what individuals and different communities would do. Goodness. Which is a very, very unfortunate thing, because when it comes to Democrats and Republicans in particular, Republicans are small government, and for entrepreneurs to do things along with individuals to do things and the free market to do things far more than Democrats are in this country. And yeah, cutting 5%, again, it's also an experts agreed thing, would reduce there. So cutting 25% is full compliance in the scenario that they set up here. Cutting 5% is partial compliance, and no action is non-compliance. Of course, 0. Let's see. Half of the participants saw no mention of foreign shaming. The other half received a passage in which foreign countries were shamed. So of the half that received passage in which foreign countries were shamed, it was one of three here. Shaming, if cut by, here. And part of the reason they had to do this is, because they had to do this so little and what have you in here. And also, violating the promises. Well, the U.S. only promised in this one. So it's after all this, after being told that the government hasn't done enough, they get to this particular aspect here. Having presented the scenario, we asked, taking into account all the decisions the U.S. government made in the passage you read, would you approve or disapprove of what the U.S. government did overall? Well, what about you? What about you, the individual who's who's reading this? Have you done anything? Again, this is all about what the government does. It's not all about what people do. That's a little bit collective to me here for sure. You presume that the government has absolute control over everything and can do absolutely everything well, which I think history is a guide that it's not necessarily true. Figure 1 displays the percentage of Americans who approved of the U.S. government's behavior. The solid dots represent approval without shaming. The hollow dots represent approval with shaming. And the lines bisecting the dots are 95% confidence intervals. Okay, so this basic thing is cutting by 25%. There's a pretty solid approval with and without, and very little difference, with shaming in here. This is the big one, of course, that they argued in the beginning was, if you're being shamed, there's much less approval of the government versus not being shamed if you're just cutting by a teeny tiny bit. And of course, if you're not doing anything, nobody cares. Anyway, what do we care what you have to say is the kind of thing there. Comparing the hollow versus solid dots, we see that shaming proved inconsequential when the U.S. took no action and when it cut emissions by 25%. In contrast, shaming substantially changed American perceptions of partial compliance. When the government cut emissions by 5%, shaming reduced public approval from 64% to 42%, depriving the government of nearly half the credit it would have received for taking modest action without shaming. We add, however, that without shaming, most Americans would approve of modest efforts such as reducing emissions by only 5%. Foreign pressure applied via shaming may help galvanize support for bolder action on climate change, which is to say, if you shame people, you can get them to do more. That's the thing. Incentive is a shorthand for the estimated gain in public approval going forward, just as a measure, so they're talking about certain things here. When foreign countries abstained from shaming, solid dots in figure 1, 64% approved of the government, of when the government complied partially versus 73% when it complied fully. Thus, without shaming, the government could gain 9 approval points by increasing its compliance from partial to full. Suppose instead that foreign countries shamed strategically by criticizing the U.S. if and only if it failed to honor its Paris pledge. That, in that case, the government could gain around 30 approval points by complying fully with the Paris Agreement. So what they're talking about here in the 30 is going from here to here with the with the approval in here. So that's kind of what they're talking about with that, is jumping from here to here. That's the incentive they're referring to, is if you shamed them, well, maybe they shamed the government and the government took action, well, your approval would jump to this much. But here's the thing. That's an assumption. They're assuming it would jump to this much. They didn't actually run the scenario here of how the approval would change if you suddenly then took action. They didn't run that. So you can't actually know that for sure. That is an assumption they're making here. Let's see. Under data from Experiment 1, we also tested whether the effects of shaming varied with partisan identity of domestic audiences. Consistent with previous research, support for climate action was strongest among Democrats and weakest among Republicans, with independents in between. Second, in all three groups, shaming reduced approval of partial compliance while having little effect when the government took no action or cut emissions by 25%. Democrats were more receptive to shaming than Republicans. That's because currently, as we look at Democrats and Republicans, Democrats are more in favor of government action on just about everything, whereas Republicans are not. If you go further to the right with libertarians most definitely are not. It's no surprise because Republicans don't have strong love for government action on everything anyway. So I don't understand why that was. I don't understand why you don't consider the political things here of whether or not you would be shaming the government if it's not even the government that gets things done. Suppose the entrepreneurs are the ones who get everything done with the Paris Agreement pledge. Government didn't have to do anything. Why are you bothering to shame the government? Let's see. Yeah, so the shaming, non-shaming. So that's the incentive approval. And this is the difference with Republicans or what have you. Let's see. So it's like the with shaming kind of thing. If you're already cutting by 25%, like Republicans are like, F you. But apparently even that thing is what I noticed there. So yeah, they're talking about this whole section with respect to pandering. Experiments 2 and 3 tested whether governments could use counter rhetoric to negate the effects of shaming. The first one was contrition, meaning, we're sorry, you're right, we should do better. That was the statement they had to read. This was 1,160 participants in October of 2018. And this is the big one right here, is that actually this is without a rebuttal and with a rebuttal after you're doing a shaming. So if they do a rebuttal where we're just like, well, we're sorry, we'll do better, the disapproval of that gets reduced dramatically. Here, the difference between the two, it actually goes back to being positive, if I'm not mistaken, because it was 64. Yeah, and then it would be -8 here. So it would still be like 53% approval of cutting 5% if you're doing an contrition there, I should say. Contrition was somewhat effective in counteracting shaming. When the government cut emissions by 5%, shaming alone caused approval to fall by 22 percentage points, but contrition reduced the effect to only 8 points. Experiment 3 focused on the other end of the counter-rhetorical spectrum, which is defiance. Participants read the whole thing of basically the government responds, you got no right to mess in our affairs. And that had the sort of counter effect. I mean, with the no action case, it obviously made something of a little bit of a difference where people were much happier with it. Here, we defending ourselves. And with the cut 25, it made very little difference. In here, this is actually within the margin of error for both of these, within the confidence intervals for both of these, so I don't think this is necessarily significant statistically. One thing I will make a critique of this paper is they didn't do any statistical significance tests, excuse me. Let's see. The last experiment, this again I want to point out, is we fielded the experiment to 2,878 subjects, and this has to do with the identity question, if it's allies or non-allies that are shaming the hell out of you. In early 2021, before President Biden took office and rejoined the Paris Agreement, conclude that the traditional distinction between allies and non-allies, though important for human rights, may not be as relevant to shaming on climate change. And that's what they're pointing out here is all of these are actually overlapping. Here, all of it's entirely overlapping, and so that says that there's not statistical significance there. But again, they didn't do any calculations to show me statistical significance, so I have no way of knowing for sure, but that would be my judgment just on the overlap of the confidence intervals here in the particular dots. So let's see. So these are their final conclusions here. We found that shaming by foreign countries shifted domestic public opinion in favor of compliance, increasing the political incentive to honor the agreement. The effects of shaming depended on the behavior of the target. However, shaming was more effective against partial compliers than against targets that took no action or honored their obligations completely. Finally, the identities of the actors, counter rhetoric such as contrition, could reduce the effect of shaming. Okay, that's general conclusions. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm just thinking, is there anything else that's important here? Nothing terribly, although I will give them credit. They did point out the issue with China versus of an autocratic regime, or I would just argue a communist regime, versus versus the other kinds of democracies, and the fact that there may be very big differences with respect to countries. So I'm glad that they pointed that out. So that's the article in question that I wanted to read through today. Again, for my locals members, this will be available for you. If you want to read it, you're welcome to go to town. And this is the thing, because I downloaded it. This is my personal copy, so I'm happy to share it. But the thing here that I've noticed with this one is that they very much ignored the differences. They acknowledged it, but they acknowledged that it's an issue, but they ignored it in this particular study, that different countries will react very differently. They focused heavily on the U.S. here in particular, and the question, of course, is this is a good example of a good study to look at an effect. And it's a good question to ask whether a communication strategy like that would work, or whether some action like that would work. It's an okay question to do in a social sciences study. I'm not complaining about that. But this is a good study where they're talking about the difference between doing the study and whether or not you should do the action in the real world, because science doesn't ever give you a moral compass. It can't. That's not the way it works. It's designed to answer questions to find the truth about something. And according to this particular study, it might very well work as a strategy to get folks to do something. Doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. That's the difference when it comes to the moral compass there. And that's going to depend upon the different countries. Because acting in your own interest, you may be very well doing that just because it gives you something in your own interest. And if you can get a country to do this and spend money and all these kinds of things, maybe it benefits you some way that you're thinking of in the strategic chess game of international politics. So that's what I wanted to point out with this. I think it's an interesting study. It caught my attention. I'm generally speaking not for naming and shaming. I don't think that's a very moral way to do it. I would actually point out the kind of positives of different things. I would take the opposite kind of tact of showing off how great my country is for doing this and this and this, and sort of just like saying, we're awesome because we did this, and trumpeting it as being a great country for doing something rather than shaming others for not doing something. So that's actually much more positive to me, that I think would actually work better and get other countries to be like, particularly as that news gets out, to get their domestic audiences to be like, oh, why don't we do that? That's amazing. Maybe that would actually work better. But that's actually gotten ignored in the study too. So that's it for now. Let me know what you think. Do you think naming and shaming would work with respect to international agreements? It's quasi worked with human rights related stuff. Kind of doubt it will work too much with climate change, but we'll see. That's it for now. If you like the video, hit the like button on the way out the door, share the video, comment on the video, all that good jazz, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to pop on over to shiosophia.locals.com if you'd like some behind the scenes things. Of course, the live Thursday thoughts will be coming up soon too. And that's it for now. Until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious, my friends.